Okay, so let's walk through how to configure IPv4. Now let me try that again. DHCP for IPv4 on a Cisco router. Now I've got a little network set up here, and we're going to use this network for a couple of different videos. You can find the packet tracer activity or the packet tracer file linked in the description. Now you will need packet tracer if you're going to follow along. But if you do have it, go ahead and download the packet tracer file and you can follow along with our activity. So we've got two different networks here separated by routers. And this network that encompasses this part right here, this is 192.168.1. This is 192.168.2. And then the connection right between these two routers, that's 192.168.3. The first two are /24. This one is a /30, and you can see IP addresses listed down here below. Now, the only thing I've configured on the routers so far is their IP addresses, and I've configured a gateway so that they can connect to each other. But the PCs on both sides have no configuration at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure DHCP on R1. I'm going to set up a DHCP server to serve addresses to these PCs. And then we'll verify that it works. And that's as far as we're going to go. In another video a little bit later on, we'll set up DHCP relay, and we'll set this up as a relay agent to serve addresses to all of these PCs. But that's going to be in another video. So if you haven't downloaded the file yet, go ahead and do so. You can follow along. Let's open up R1, go to our command line, and let's start configuring DHCP. Now, one thing real quick. Normally, you're not going to want to run DHCP on a router. Normally, you'll have a server or something there that you can run DHCP on, and that's actually my preferred approach. However, there are times when I have a small network and I don't have a dedicated server there and I want DHCP to be handled locally, so I will set up DHCP on a Cisco router in those instances. So we're going to start by going to our global config. Now, from here, let me do a real quick do show IP interface brief. Remember putting do in front of a command. You do this when you're in config mode, and it will execute the command as if you were in privileged exec mode. And so here you can see our IP addresses and our interfaces, and everything is up. So we want to serve IP addresses for the 192.168.1 network. Now, before we can set up DHCP to serve those addresses, the first thing we got to do, and normally it doesn't matter which order you do configurations in on a Cisco device, but this one it actually does. We need to start by excluding IP addresses before we start configuring them. So what we mean by that is when we configure DHCP, we'll tell it which network we want to do DHCP addressing for, and it will immediately start handing out those addresses beginning with number 1. And so what we have to do is we have to exclude IP addresses before we configure the DHCP pool, or if you're familiar with Windows terminology, the DHCP scope. So the command is IP DHCP excluded, and the entire command is excluded address. And then you'll put your starting address, 192.168, and I want to exclude everything from 1.1 to 168. See if I can type here. .1.50. And so we'll start serving at 51. Now, this is going to give me addresses that I can use for my networking equipment, so my routers, my switches, I can use it for my servers. Anything else I want statically assigned, I can assign within this range, and the DHCP server won't try to hand out those addresses. So it's IP DHCP excluded addresses. We set the first address, the last address, and it will exclude everything in between those. Now that we've got that done, we're going to create our pool. So the command is IP DHCP pool, and then we're going to give it a pool name. And I'm going to call this LAN 1. Now I did that in all caps, not because it's required, but because when you do a show run or you're looking at running config, if you use named objects like pools and access control lists and things like that, if you do that in all caps, it's going to make them stand out in the config better. So that's going to create my pool. Now let me question mark this so you can see what the options are. And remember, I'm in packet tracer, so this isn't going to have everything. But it's going to have the stuff that we need. It lets us set a default router. It lets us set our DNS server, Both of those are things you'll normally want to set. The domain name is kind of optional, but it can be useful. And then you're going to specify the network, and notice it's the network number and mask. And what it means by that is the network's IP address, or the subnet address, and then the mask. So let's do network 192.168.1.0, and then we have to put the subnet mask, which is going to be 255.255.255.0, and that's going to tell it we're going to do everything within this network, and that's why it was so important to do our excluded addresses up here. Otherwise, it would start handing out anything in this network starting with its own IP address, in this case .1. So let me set my default router. So I'm going to do DEF 192.168.1.1. I'm going to set the DNS server. And this I'm just going to make up. We're going to say it's 192.168.1.10. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the domain name. Now, not technically required, but we're going to go ahead and do it. lan1.local. Okay, so now when I exit out of here, this is what my running config should look like. I do a show run, and here's my excluded addresses, and here's my pool LAN1. Now I can create more than one pool. But if I'm going to serve, I have to get a request from something in that network. So what's going to happen is this pool is for 192.168.1, right? So it's not going to use that pool to serve a DHCP request it gets on this interface. It's only going to use that pool to serve addresses on an interface that's in that network as well. So anything that comes in on G01 is going to show up at an IP address, an interface with an IP address of 192.168.1.1, which is going to match this network, which means we will use this pool to assign addresses. We'll assign addresses out of this pool for DHCP requests we get on that particular interface. And that's how we make sure we don't respond to addresses on the wrong interface. Now this is going to be different when we start using DHCP relay or IPv6, but this is how we guarantee in DHCPv4 on a local interface that we don't assign addresses out of the wrong pool. Okay, let me go ahead and close my connection to my router. Now my router should be configured at this point. My PCs, now this is a little idiosyncrasy with Packet Tracer. With Packet Tracer, our devices default to static configuration. Every other device in the world defaults to DHCP. So I'm going to select DHCP, it requests an address, and it says request was successful, and right here is my first address, 192.168.1.51. Remember we excluded 1 through 50, so this is first available address. Gives me the subnet mask, my default gateway, and my DNS server. Perfect. That's working exactly the way we want it to. Go ahead and close this. I'm going to do the same thing with PC 1 that we did with PC 0. That got 52. And then this one should pick up 53. Desktop, IP, DHCP. Bingo. All right, we now have configured these 3 PCs using DHCP off of our server on R1. Let's go back to R1 here for a minute. And now that we've got some actual address assignments, we can do a show IP DHCP question mark, and you'll see what we can play with. We can look at bindings, conflict, pool, or relay. Now we're not using this one right now, so let's look at our show IP DHCP pool. And that's going to give us information about our pool. We have 3 leased addresses. We have 1 excluded address. Now that doesn't mean that we only have excluded 1 address. We actually excluded way more than that. But it's one that we're aware of. We have no pending events. 1 subnet is currently in the pool. This is the address range. This is how many we have leased, how many we have excluded, how many we have total. All right, but that really doesn't tell me who did what. So let's do show IP DHCP bindings. And this is going to show us which address is linked to, which IP address is linked to which MAC address. And so now we can backtrack and see who has what IP address based on their hardware or MAC address. Now the last one here is show IP DHCP conflict. And this is going to show us any conflicts with addressing that our DHCP server is aware of. Ideally, you won't have any. I mean, obviously, we don't want conflicts. That just sounds bad, right? So a conflict is when you have two devices that have the same IP address. And so if you have two DHCP servers in your network that are handing out addresses in the same range, that is a distinct possibility. If you have somebody manually configuring IP addresses and they pick an address that's in the DHCP pool range, that's going to be a distinct possibility. But if you're configured well, you shouldn't have any. So let me go ahead and copy run start to save our configuration. And that is how you configure and verify DHCP on a Cisco router.